The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the participants and do not reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
BronxNet. Your voice, your views, your vision.
Straight ahead on this edition of Perspectives, we go front and center with the 13th Congressional District debate. Charlie Rangel, is his seat in jeopardy? That's front and center on this edition of Perspectives with yours truly, Darren Jaime.
Anything relevant to life, you bring it to the table. Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable. No fables, you speak on your decisions. Cause in the long run, it's your voice, your views, your vision. Keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective, which shines a light. Cause it might make a difference in someone else's life. What's your perspective?
Express what's in your heart and your mind. Share your perspective.
What's your perspective?
Come on up on this edition of Perspectives. Today, voters head to the polls in the primary election for the 13th Congressional District, a race featuring Congressman incumbent Charlie Rangel going up against Adriano Espinal, who's considered the major favorite, also Pastor Michael Waldron. And we're going to talk here on Perspectives about the race today. Going to let people know exactly, well, some issues pertaining to the race. How much is race a factor in this race? Also, is the congressman incumbent washed up? Or what does the district actually need? Joining us here in studio to share a little bit about this is Kenneth J. Thomas, who is the president and founder of Quantum Path Consulting. And good to have you sharing with us, and welcome to Perspectives.
Good to be here.
Good. So let's talk about this for a minute. Everybody's front and center on this. How is this race going to pan out? And, you know, from your perspective, do you have a prediction?
I do have a prediction. I think it's Rangel by, again, 1,000 votes or so. So I think it's a repeat of 2012.
You think it's just going to be very close?
Very close, definitely. I think up until the 1199 endorsement, I believe it was a toss-up. But I think the endorsement gives him the edge.
Okay, so a lot of people feel this 1199 endorsement will give him the edge. There's some people who say, listen, you still can't discount the fact that Senator Adriano Espinal, who, if he is elected, would become the first Dominican congressman ever in the history of the United States Congress, and in a heavy Democratic Dominican community. You can't say this is a walkaway.
Absolutely not. I think that's why the 1199 endorsement was so powerful, because it, in essence, legitimized Rangel's campaign. And it's ironic because here you have this 40-plus year incumbent, and I'm saying an endorsement legitimized his campaign. But up until that endorsement, I think there was some concerns within his ranks that, okay, where is the momentum coming from? And right, you had a redistrict, you had the boundaries of the district redrawn to encompass parts of the Western Bronx, Northern Manhattan. Right, it's heavily concentrated with Dominican voters. And Espaillat came within 1,000 votes in 2012 of succeeding Rangel. But the problem is, how many voters did Espaillat register in these 2 years? Like, how effective was his ground game in these last 2 years? And right, so you have a significant Dominican population in the Western Bronx and in the Northern Manhattan, but it also tells, like, did his operation convert a lot of these constituents into registered voters? And will these registered voters turn out for the primary?
Well, we'll find out in a short amount of time, as the voters are going to the polls today to actually make their vote. But the question that really begs asking is, yes, he lost by 1,000 votes the last time. But to some people, that's a momentum builder. To say, listen, you know what? We came this close. Let's go out, put a little bit of extra emphasis. And for those persons that were on the fence, who didn't go out to vote and say, does my vote really matter? Now you go back and say, you know what? My vote does count. This kind of can be a tipping point for Espaillat.
Absolutely. I think 2 years ago, the outcome legitimized Espaillat as a viable candidate for Congress. I think the issue would be is, so he has his base in the Dominican voters in Washington Heights and in the Western Bronx. And I think Charlie Rangel has his base in Harlem primarily with the black voters. And I think the swing voters are the Puerto Rican voters, specifically the prime voters in the district. And so I think that's why the race is sort of pivoted to this, the racial undertones being presented. And I think it came to a head last week or a few weeks ago, in terms of Rangel saying, okay, focusing on the fixation of the Dominican vote and Adriano Espaillat portraying himself as sort of the Dominican congressman up to bat. And I think that's the issue, the racial overtones. And I think, in essence, Charlie Rangel sort of wrote off the Dominican vote and said, look, there's no way I'm going to penetrate that base, so I might as well write them off, galvanize the black prime voters, and see if I can acquire the swing vote, which is the Puerto Rican votes. Because I think, in essence, you had the borough president, Ruben Diaz, endorse Espaillat. You had the council speaker, Melissa Mark Verito, endorse Espaillat. And so, in essence, you had a shifting or pivoting of the Puerto Rican voters towards Espaillat. But
let me ask this question. How much is race the factor here? Because we talked a lot about it, and we talked about, Dominican vote, the Puerto Rican vote, the African-American vote, all of this 13th congressional district. And it's amazing to say that we haven't even got to talk about some issues yet, because race seems to be, or how much is, that primary factor.
Well, I think in terms of the policy differences, they aren't really. I think this is a strongly Democratic district. You have strong left-leaning candidates. So I don't really think the issue is focusing on the minutia between the differences of policy between Espaillat and Rangel. I think
there are some huge differences.
There are some huge differences, but I think the more compelling aspect of the race is race. In essence, the Dominican vote, the Puerto Rican vote, and the black vote. And so I think that's why there's been such a fixation in the media with regard to, all right, well, this is the hot button issue. This is the most salacious element aspect of the campaign thus far.
Talk to us about Charles Rangel using the Latino race card, talking about Espaillat wants to be the first Dominican congressman. Was it a good move to make, bad move that could backfire? Of course, the hours upon us right now. We'll find out in a short little while.
Right, we'll find out. I think it was a good move. I think fundamentally, probably his inner circle came to the conclusion that we, in essence, have to write off the Dominican vote. Let's attempt to galvanize our base. Let's attempt to, and I think this is an insidious sort of assessment, but I think it was, all right, well, can we exploit the friction between Puerto Ricans and Dominicans by sort of characterizing Espaillat as this Dominican candidate, in essence, then fomenting this dissent with the Puerto Rican voters and saying, well, okay, well, there's been this long-standing rivalry between Puerto Ricans and Dominicans in this city for generations, and so can we exploit that and capitalize on that today?
It's going to be pretty interesting to watch, and of course, people are going to the polls today to vote, and this is the one race that we're paying particular attention to here in the borough of the Bronx, because yes, it could be the opportunity for the senator to unseat a 40-year congressman, and that would be major news, not just here in the borough of the Bronx, but really across America. Talk about if he's able to pull this off, what does this really mean?
Well, it's a symbolic race. I think, again, I'm not paying much attention to the differences in policy, because I think the symbolism behind the race is far more resonating. If you look at it, Rangel represents sort of the old guard, old Harlem, and pardon the pun, but right, so this is sort of old Harlem. This is sort of established black centralized location, and he's coasted on this for 40 plus years. Espaillat represents New Harlem, New Manhattan, more gentrified, more diverse, more Latino. And so I think it's the symbolism. So you have these two opposing forces. You have old Harlem fighting sort of the new guard, old guard fighting new guard. And I think so that's the biggest issue. And I think that's why it's so symbolic. And that's why there's such a vested interest on both sides to have a fruitful outcome. So, right, I think this is so important for the Dominican electorate to have this a watershed moment. similar to Obama winning in 2008. This is a watershed moment. This would be a historic moment. This would legitimize the ascendancy of the Dominicans as a racial demographic, as an ethnic demographic in the city. And so I think it's so important. So I can understand wholeheartedly why it's become so contentious, because they're on the verge. This is their moment. And so I understand it. And you see the demographic shifts. And this is why Charlie Rangel's on his heels, because there is this symbolism, there is this demographic shift that has compelled him to fight for his political life.
Now, in the wake of talking about Charlie Rangel and Senator Espaillat, there are two other candidates that we have not yet mentioned.
Yes.
Pastor Michael Waldron,
yes.
pastor of the First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem, who has also put his hat into the ring. Talk about him for a second.
You know, honestly, I always felt like he was a spoiler. This was a person who sort of absorbed some of the black electorate for Charlie Rangel. And I think clearly that's the case. In essence, this doesn't hurt Espaillat. This hurts Rangel. Waldron has a base in Harlem. He's very popular within that small ecosystem, and so this could definitely absorb some votes from Rangel. And then the interesting thing is the Sharpton connection. So Sharpton hasn't outwardly endorsed anyone, but it to me looks like a tacit endorsement for Espaillat. I think anyone who's in the political game understands that Michael Waldron was never relevant, in the sense that, all due respect to the man, but wasn't relevant in the sense that he ever had a shot at winning this congressional race. So anyone who endorsed Waldron, and a lot of Al Sharpton's backers supported him and provided him with campaign contributions. To me, that always looked like tacit endorsements of Espaillat, but just so it was for a more politically correct endorsement. So instead of outwardly endorsing Espaillat or outwardly supporting Espaillat, you support a third-party candidate, in essence, who has no legit shot at winning, but who draws money and who draws support from the viable candidate, which is Rangel. And so it's sort of an interesting backdrop in terms of, and I think it also speaks to the symbolism behind the old Harlem being gradually phased out in terms of the Dinkins and the Pattersons and Rangel being part of the Gang of Four, and saying, like, look, this is a new era, and this is people sort of hedging their bets and saying, okay, Espaillat is the future, and this is sort of the future of Manhattan, certainly the future of upper Manhattan and Harlem and in the Western Bronx, and so people have jumped ship.
Kenneth Thomas, our guest here on Perspectives. We invite you to stay tuned. We'll continue to talk more about the primary, the Democratic primary that's being held today. And coming up after the break, we're going to talk about a couple of those issues. Yes, there are some issues that we're talking about other than race, and we'll highlight those in just a few seconds. Stay with us. You'll be right back in a few seconds.
Jimmy can't sing,
And Tommy can't dance.
so we're gonna put some ants in their pants.
Kids will spend 22 minutes watching us, the super duper party troopers, singing about ants in their pants.
Isn't that funny? Ants in their pants, they've got ants in their pants, they've got ants in their pants.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain later. 2 minutes, twice a day. They have the time.
So you heard of the Chewbacca fish?
Yeah.
Chewbacca who? Well, you heard of the Chewbacca fish, haven't you?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And just so the people at home know, describe it real quick for us.
Describe what?
A fish that flies out of the water almost like a rocket. It goes like 12 feet in the air. And then what happens is it comes back down before it hits the water. It like flies into people's neck and like starts biting you in the neck and in the face.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. If it's out there, I'm going to catch it on camera, because I've been out here with my camera for years.
You know how the Chewbacca fish works? What happens is it shoots, it like rockets out of the water like 5 feet in the air. And then as it jumps. And then what happens, like 5 feet in the air, comes down, right before it hits the water, like it does a psych, and one of these moves and flies into your neck and starts like biting you and stuff.
Nah. They don't have the fish like that out here, do they?
Yeah, it's the Chewbacca fish. That's what
they have it out here in the Bronx.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And then what happens is right before it comes and hits the water.
Yeah, he tried to hit somebody.
Exactly.
Llegaron los caballos.
Back here on Perspectives, the topic of conversation, primary day as voters are heading to the polls. The Democratic primary considered to be the hottest race in New York, that of Congressman Charlie Rangel, the incumbent, going up against Senator Adriano Espinat. And the question is whether or not he will be able to, being the congressman, pull it off one more time. The last time these two got together, a margin of 1,000 votes actually was the determining factor between both of them. How's it going to work out this time round? And we're pleased to be joined by Kenneth J. Thomas, who's the president and founder of Quantum Path Consulting, who's been sharing his thoughts. And, you know, one of the things we talked about was race and how much race was a factor. Obviously, this is so much not just a factor with race, it's a factor politically. So much so that Mayor de Blasio says, I'm not endorsing anybody. Right. You heard about Al Sharpton. Yeah. You said Al Sharpton isn't endorsing anybody. Mayor de Blasio says, listen, you know what? I know all of them well. I'm not making an endorsement until after. You know, what's the mayor doing? Is the mayor playing it safe?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think every elected official has but so much political capital that they can sort of expend. And you expend some of this political capital by endorsing certain candidates. I think this race is still very close to call, too close to call. And because it's so racially charged, and I have to pivot back to that, de Blasio runs the risk of antagonizing either Rangel's black base or Espaillat's Dominican base. And at this point, he probably made the determination that it's not worth the risk. Mm-hmm. And again, and I think, and again, he's sort of playing it smart, playing it safe, because ultimately policy issues, if SBI gets down to D.C., ultimately policy issues will be, the distinctions will be in minutia, be the minutia of who does what, who funds what. So I think it's a smart move. It's an adept move by Rangel. Really, any elected that's sort of kept out the fray, because policy issues won't really matter if SBI wins today and gets down to legislate in D.C. It won't really matter. So it's about really antagonizing or galvanizing a base. Mm-hmm. And at this point, for any citywide elected official, it's best to stay out of this.
Well, I was having dinner with some Washington insiders recently, and we were talking about this particular race and the fact that if the senator is able to unseat Congressman Rangel, what it actually means for New York. Because while the senator will tout that, you know, the congressman has lost his political influence, the congressman needs to, you know, take a seat, to which the congressman actually rebutted in one particular comment he said in the debate, and I say, quote, he says, if I thought for 1 minute that either one of the candidates that are can go to Washington, I'd be home with my wife and grandkids. This is what Congressman incumbent Charlie Rangel says. But if the senator ends up making it down to Washington, talk about political influence and political impact. We know that Congressman Rangel is a high-ranking congressman. Mm-hmm. The senator doesn't go in at the same level as the congressman. Absolutely. He starts at the bottom of the barrel. Talk about delivery for New York.
It hurts New York. Absolutely. At least in the short run, it hurts New York. So the Democrats are in the minority in the House. So not only is the House and the Democrats are in the minority in the House, but he comes in as a freshman congressman. And so in terms of funding, in terms of legislation, he takes a step back, and it hurts. It hurts the New York delegation, and I think that's why you've seen so much institutional support on a national level back Rangel, because they sort of understand the implications from a national perspective and saying, okay, this not only hurts the New York delegation, but it hurts the House Democrats as a body. And but certainly I can understand Espaillat's perspective in terms of a fresh face, new blood, possibly some new ideas, a more energetic elected official representing the New York delegation in D.C., or being part of the New York delegation in D.C. But I think the power brokers, like your Chuck Schumers, you know, like your Kirsten Gillibrands, like they've all backed Rangel because they sort of understand the implications and sort of deferred the issue another 2 years and saying, okay, well, let's get Charlie back in office for the 2014 election cycle and deal with the issue or suspend dealing with the issue up until 2016, when we have to then come to terms with how do we effectuate a more seamless transition.
Because that transition can be both powerful in working or quite dangerous, and New York really hangs in the balance.
Well, certainly.
Now, I've heard the senator talk about and challenge Congressman Rangel on the issue of housing. The senator says when it comes to new housing developments, he makes a proposal that there should be a 40% market as opposed to the typical 80% market, and he mandates about 30% of that market should be available for small business. Yes, no, maybe so. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think SBI's perspective is emblematic of the sort of progressive populist wave that's sort of taken over New York City. And it's not a negative reflection of SBI, and it's not a negative reflection of this progressive populist wave that's taken over, but he is a representative on a more localized level of certain interests, and so he has to sort of focus on that, and that's what sort of influences policy positions, I believe. I think if once you get involved and become part of the body politic at the federal level, you sort of understand the machinations a bit more organically, and know that, look, is it fiscally palatable to developers that you have these sort of ratios? And I think that's what you see, and I think it's effective rhetoric on the local level within New York City, within his particular state senate district. Absolutely, that's sort of like the I guess instead of red meat, the blue meat for his constituents. They say they love this. They say more affordable housing. But when you get at a federal level and you sort of understand, look, there's more implications at play, you have to then sort of scale back and become more conservative to be a more viable legislator. And so I think that's sort of the distinction. And I think that's why I always say policy differences will sort of, they'll converge once, if SBI wins today and he becomes a representative, and once he's dealing with the DC power brokers and he sort of understands, I have to sort of scale back and sort of moderate my positions. Where in New York City, within this sort of local political ecosystem, you can be fairly liberal in your perspectives and in fiscal policies, because this is what resonates with the constituency in New York City at this point.
Talk to us about Harlem for a minute, because that is Congressman Charlie Rangel's home base. Harlem has seen that resurgence due to the economic empowerment zone. We've seen, and I'm a former resident of Harlem that was born and raised there. I saw Harlem in its worst days when there was, Woolworths and, a lot of unoccupied, vacant buildings. The Apollo Theater was pretty much...
I recall as well. Yeah.
Right. So, given the fact that we see this resurgence of Harlem, you have a certain population of people that are very happy to see what's going on. And then you see the fact that there's this mixed culture, and quote unquote, in some people's terms, the mixed multitude has now taken over Harlem. Your thought about whether or not this actually hurts Rangel, helps Rangel? Because you have some people who are happy about what's happening, and you have a lot of people who still say, you know what, this is nothing more than the beginning of the gentrification that takes place in Harlem. And they label Charlie Rangel as being one of the co-conspirators in that.
Right. And absolutely, I think the key concept in all of this is gentrification and sort of the displacement of old Harlem. And it's a sort of an interesting dichotomy. You have Charlie Rangel, who at least symbolically represents old Harlem. He represents those sort of veteran constituents who come out to vote. Those are the prime voters. Prime voters typically skew towards the senior citizens. And then New Harlem, gentrified Harlem, he helped sort of facilitate that environment, help cultivate a more gentrified Harlem. I think it remains to be seen how effective SBI can be at playing against that and saying and sort of exposing it, so to speak. I mean, 2 years ago, I don't think that was the case. I think it was such a close race only because the districts were redrawn, the district boundaries were redrawn. I don't think Charlie Rangel's base is overtly concerned about his association with the development of Harlem, because it's a tough position to play. It's, well, how do you facilitate development in a particular community without there being sort of the lingering specter of gentrification? It's sort of, as I see it, it becomes part and parcel of the process of the sort of evolution of any. You see it in the South Bronx now. And so can you look at any local elected official and say, or a congressional member and say, okay, you're a co-conspirator to gentrification, which is now displacing a lot of sort of the indigenous residents of these communities. It's tough to play. Do we want development, or do we want to keep out gentrification?
To continue our conversation, we'll be right back with more perspectives right after this. Some final comments, and we'll wind things up. We'll be right back.
Kids will spend 15 minutes watching online videos like this one.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain later. 2 minutes, twice a day. They have the time.
Mom, can we get some ice cream? Please, Mom, please.
No, we're having dinner soon.
Please.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. There are thousands of children in foster care who will take you just as you are.
We're going to wrap up our final conversation with Kenneth, and before we go, either person who wins in a few hours we'll know, well, a little while actually we'll know, either person who wins is going to have to do some work. If it's Rangel in that Dominican community, and if it's the senator in Harlem in that neighborhood.
Absolutely.
Are you optimistic that either way it goes, that the winner will be able to delve into, quote unquote, the enemy's camp and be successful?
I'm more optimistic about Espaillat, I think, because he has a longer trajectory if he gets into Congress. So he would definitely have to appeal to the African-American base, at the very least, in order to stave off constant primaries every 2 years. I think so. I'm more optimistic about him. I think this is Charlie Rangel's last hurrah, and he's probably more focused on how to facilitate a more seamless transition in 2 years. Who will succeed him? And I think it will be a Latino.
All right. Cam Thomas, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us here on Perspectives. As we said, the polls will be closing very shortly, and then we will have a winner. We want you to stay tuned to Perspectives because we will have an in-depth wrap-up of this congressional primary, what it actually means for the borough of the Bronx, what does it mean for Harlem, and most of all, what it means for the 13th Congressional District. I'm Darren Jaime saying thank you for watching. Until the next time we meet, stay safe and share your perspective with somebody else. It just might make a difference in their life. Take care.
Whether you make a move solo or a movement with a stable, no fables to speak on your decisions, cause in the long run it's your voice, your views, your vision, keeping it real with many messages for you to know. This ain't radio, but DJ runs the show. Entertainment, he rocks it. Politics, he locks it. The host with the most would handle any topic. Don't forget to share your perspective which shines a light, cause it might make a difference in someone else's life. What's your perspective?